So here we are at Mishpatim. This is a part of Exodus that when it comes to deciding what to speak about in these chapters of Exodus, I will admit I become overwhelmed because there's so much in them. It's hard to narrow down a topic. The events of these chapters are absolutely overflowing with important messages for us. Mishpatim, this portion, takes us from the time after Israel had the phenomenal experience of, it says in the text, literally seeing the voice of God, to the point just before the epic building of the wilderness tabernacle. If we include the narrative of the last portion, in portion Yitro, with this one, it includes God manifesting his glory before the children of Ad, the declaration of a covenant, the stipulations of that covenant, the ratification of the covenant, and then another epiphany, another encounter with God. It's bookended by appearances of God. This portion begins with the listing of, as Weston said, 53 commandments, known in Hebrew as Mishpatim. That word is most often translated as judgments. It occurs 400 and some odd times, and more than 3/4 of that time it's translated as judgment. There's a description of the ratification of the Sinaitic covenant. This ratification generally doesn't get the attention that the earlier revelation of God at the Ten Commandments gets. But it's equally as important. That's why I want to talk about it today. It includes, as I said, a theophany, a manifestation of God. And it's one in which humans actually get to see God and live. It's a very important event. Depicts an extremely important moment in the history of the Jewish people. It also depicts an extremely important moment in the covenant history of mankind. After today, I hope what I have to share with you, I hope it'll help you to see how this moment is not only the foundational moment of the eternal covenant with the sons of Jacob, but also how it forms the foundational pattern for the ratification of the new or renewed covenant under the mediation of our Messiah, Yeshua. Exodus 24 begins with an invitation from Adonai to Moses at verses 1 and 2. Then to Moses he said, "Come up to Adonai, you, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and the 70 elders of Israel, and worship from afar." Moses alone is to approach Adonai, but the others may not draw near, nor are the people to go up with him. Moses and the dignitaries of the children of Israel received a very special invitation here. Come up to Adonai, keep a little distance, but worship him. Literally, bow low from afar is what the words say. Moses alone is the only one who can actually come near, but the others shall not come near, nor shall the people crowd along and come into this. This was an exclusive invitation. It extended to the leadership of Israel, including the covenant mediator, Moses, and the legislative body, that's the elders. It included the high priest and his 2 sons. We'll learn later in this chapter that it also included Joshua, the one who would take over for Moses eventually. Notice that there's a gradation here of nearness to God. Moses is the closest, the priests and the elders at some distance, and finally the people farthest off. But before they can make their way to the mountain to receive this invitation, to fulfill this invitation, there's something extremely important they have to do. And as always, Moses returns to the people and explains what he has just received from God. He tells it to them. Their reaction is their affirmation of intent to be in covenant with God. It shows their hearts were ready to be in covenant with God and to abide by his stipulations. It says in verse 3, you heard, with one voice, all the things that the Lord said we will do. With one voice. They were in great unity there. We saw this unity once before in Exodus chapter 15 at the far side of the Yom Suf, the Sea of Reeds. With one voice, they all declared. We say that each week when we do the Mi Chamocha. Then the text tells us that Moses wrote down all the commandments of Adonai, all these 53 that we had. Thus Moses, the scribe, has begun the task of writing the Torah. This is where this began. The text then tells us that he set up an altar, a mitzbeach, and around it he put 12 matzbeas. So similar sounding word. The first word is altar, mitzbeach. The second word means something placed in a standing position as a representation of something. It's a noun derived from the verb natsav, which means to stand, or to mainly to stand as a monument. It's the one that eventually gets a Torah portion named after in the end of Deuteronomy, Nitzavim, you stand this day. It would appear that what Moses built was very likely an earthen altar, which had been commanded in chapter 20, verse 24. Switching to guns. So God had commanded back in chapter 20, verse 24, that the only suitable altar to be made was an altar of earth. If you think about that, the same thing that humans were made out of. That's what he asked the altar to be made out of. And don't go getting fancy and cutting rocks and making it all pretty. No, he made things perfectly, and so he wants the altar to be an earthen altar or unhewn stones. And then Moses places 12 stones around it, one for each tribe. Now, during the Second Temple period, I've taught this before, I hope you've caught it, the Pharisaic movement, it was a reform movement during the time of the Hasmonean kings. The Pharisaic movement made an effort to recognize that our own dinner table in our home could be looked upon as an echo of the altar at the temple, so that each meal that you took in the presence of God then had the sanctity of an offering on the altar. We might consider how this particular arrangement that Moses built might give a good foundation for such an interpretation. If you think about it, try to picture it in your mind's eye. He created a flat mound of earth. It's almost a picture of a table. And these stones being placed around it upright, or as though 12 men standing around this table. A table with literally all Israel around it. The sacrificial meal included, it tells us, whole offerings and zebachim shlamim, peace offerings of bullocks offered to God by fire. Whole offerings are not shared by the offerer. They are totally burnt, everything. From the tip of the nose to the hooves, everything is burned on that. They're given entirely to God. However, peace offerings are actually eaten also by the priest and by the offerer who offers it. The fatty parts would be offered to God, and certain organs burnt on the altar, but everyone shares in it. As Israel ate this bullock, it also, the smoke of the olah offerings and the fatty parts rose to heaven. Thus, Israel and God himself participated in this meal, if you will, together. And prior to the meal, the altar and the children of Israel were consecrated with the blood of the offering which was collected in bowls. The bowls of blood came into play in verse 7, you just heard read. He took the scroll of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. Again they said, all that Adonai has spoken, we will do and obey. Then Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, behold, the blood of the covenant, which Adonai has cut with you, in agreement with all these words. Moses reads the Torah in the hearing of Israel, and they repeat what they said earlier, but they added something. I don't know if you caught that. They added something. All that Adonai has said we will do and keep. Not say we will do. That's doing. V'nishma, we will keep or guard or observe. This declaration is the same thing that they said back in verse 3, but they added that v'nishma, we will observe, guard, and keep. This makes sense since they had just heard all of the 53 Mishpatim. They were commanded. And now a great moment happens. Moses takes the bowls of the blood from the bullock and Zerach, and he casts it on them, right? And what did he say? This is the blood of the covenant, which Adonai has made with you according to all these words. Devarim, according to all these words. That can be matters, according to all these matters. What are the matters? The words of the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments, and the words of the Torah portion, Mishpatim, the 53 ways that you begin to implement the 10 commandments. If we take the sense of matters for that word devarim, then in effect they are saying we will do and we will watch ourselves with respect to ethical, civil, and religious matters. The people were committing to a life of Torah. It's a commitment to living according to the things that matter most to God. And we know what those are because Yeshua told us about them. Justice, mercy, and faithfulness. If you boil the 53 commandments down in this Torah portion to their basic gist, you will find these three categories. And by that I mean matters, devarim, at hand, are things like transforming slavery from a brutal institution into a temporary economic expedient, manslaughter, restitution for injury. These are matters of justice, and they're listed in this group of 53. Things like the proper management of livestock, tort reform, and civil liability, responsibility for others, sexual morality, care for widows and orphans, lending money. These are ethical matters, matters of mercy to your fellow human being. And then it commanded us in these 53 things like first fruits, keeping the pilgrimage festival, keeping the Sabbath, the sabbatical year, the sanctity of the altar, staying true to the covenant with the one true God. These are matters of faithfulness, faithfulness to God. The 53 matters of Mishpatim are matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness, just as Yeshua said. These are the devarim, the matters that are central to living in covenant with God, the civil, moral, and ritual, all intertwined in the making of the covenant people of Israel. Minor matters and weightier matters, all woven together. You know, when Yeshua spoke of that, he was talking to certain Pharisees who were, in his view, hypocritical. I paraphrase a little bit. He said, "Woe to you, hypocrite Pharisees and scribes, for you tithe mint and dill, but neglect the weightier devarim, the weightier matters of the Torah, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." The thing that all the people agreed to was to live a moral, ethical, and righteous life, focusing on such matters as mercy, justice, and truth. This has been the case for the descendants of Jacob everywhere in which the Lord has scattered us. In Matthew, Yeshua didn't come to innovate this idea of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He came to remind first century leaders that Israel is supposed to be about justice, mercy, and faithfulness, as commanded right here in this Torah portion. That had been the intent all along of the Torah. This is how God expects Israel to live. So when we look at the settlements in which Jews have been scattered among the nations, we find what? We find hospitals, we find charities, we find massive philanthropic organizations founded and supported by the descendants of these very people who stood at the base of the mountain. Just as they were commanded and just as they said, all that you say, we will do and guard. And this covenant was sealed. How was it sealed? It was sealed in the blood of an offering on the altar. Yeshua and Moses said it. This is the blood of the covenant. Those are Moshe's words. Words which I'm sure you heard just a moment ago, right? When we quoted from Matthew chapter 26, 27 through 28, it just said it. And he took the cup, and after giving thanks, he gave to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the removal of sins." Luke 22:20 actually adds a word in there. This cup is the new covenant or renewed covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Brit Chadashah, new covenant or renewed covenant. Yeshua very clearly and intentionally connected his table to the altar which was at the base of Mount Sinai. Looking as it did like a table with 12 stones around it, just as his table had 12 apostles around it. He repeated the words which Moses spoke. He took this third cup from the Seder service, the cup of redemption, and he connected it to the bowls of blood that Moses scattered on the people. In so doing, Yeshua made it clear that his blood would stand in for the blood of those whole offerings and peace offerings that they had on the earthen altar some 1,400 years before that time. In fact, the blood of that altar, the earthen altar, was a foreshadowing of the moment of Yeshua's Passover. This was Yeshua, the covenant mediator, just as Moses was the covenant mediator. But there is much more to the connection between Yeshua's Passover table and the covenant ratification at Mount Sinai. They still had that invitation to come up to the top of the mountain. The text goes on in verse 9, "Then Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up." They made Aliyah. Those very special leaders of the children of Israel participated in the covenant ratification at the base of the mountain, and then they proceeded up the mountain as they had been invited. Now they're all acting as representatives of Israel before God. This is the responsibility of leadership laid on their shoulders. The people remained at the base, literally sprinkled, spattered in the blood of the covenant. And the distinguished delegation of representatives ascended the mountain, also sprinkled and splattered in the blood of the covenant, to draw near to the cloud on the top of the smoking mountain. Perhaps in this we can see how God and Yeshua viewed Israel's leadership. They have the profound responsibility of leading the flock, but also the even more profound responsibility of being designated representatives of that flock before God. As Yeshua said, "To whom much is given, much is expected." This is why Yeshua was constantly coming and speaking to the leadership of Israel, to the priests, and to the leaders of the Pharisees. Here in this Torah portion that we're reading, this group of dignitaries with all this responsibilities had a theophany. Verse 10 says, "They saw the God of Israel, and under his feet was something like a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the very heavens." These were 75 special men. We learn in the next few verses that Joshua was actually there too. Moses, Nadab, Abihu, the 70 elders. This is the leadership in the wilderness. Their responsibility brought them to something that only a handful of people in history were ever privy to. They saw God. Unlike other theophanies in the Bible, the words are pretty sparing here. Under his feet was something like a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the heavens. That's about all they say. But note that God has feet. So it is arguable that in this encounter with God, he seemed to have the appearance of a man. But of course, no ordinary man. This is a human-like figure that is divine, but apparently in a form that was somehow not lethal to the 75 men who stood at some distance. What does it say in verse 11? Yet he did not raise his hand against the nobles of Bnei Yisrael. So they beheld God and ate and drank. Here are the elements of this verse that you just heard. There's a potential for the wrath of God, but it is withheld. And so the nobles of Israel actually beheld God and they ate and drank. These are all the parts of it. It's a very puzzling verse. God willed that they would not be harmed, but his presence, which they, by his presence, which they beheld. Moreover, they did something that seems like a non sequitur at that moment. They see God, sapphire under his feet, and what do? They eat and drink. Where did the food and drink come from? Did they pack a lunch for a field trip? Was it manna and water? Was it bread and wine? Was it the meat from the sacrifices at the foot of the mountain? Was the drink the wine that was yet to be commanded to accompany every sacrifice? Look, we'll never know this for sure. You can speculate it all you want. You'll never know for sure. But what we can know is this: they did not die even though they beheld God, which is what is supposed to happen when a mere human gets that close. And this resulted in them enjoying a meal in his very presence. In other words, we might say it in modern parlance, we might say it like this: by the grace of God, they did not die. So they were able to eat and drink in his presence, in the presence of God himself. In that sense, God was at the table with them. As they say, they were communing with God through a meal, which they beheld in his presence, and their lives were spared. So we might add to our statement this: saved by grace, the dignitaries of Israel had a communion meal with God. That's what's going on here. It's a picture of our communion meal. The point I'm trying to make is that the totality of the ratification of the Sinaitic covenant forms the basis for the ratification of the new covenant around the table in the upper room with Yeshua and his apostles. Both the ceremony at the base of the mountain with Israel and this special meal that only the dignitaries were invited to are captured in the gospel text describing the Passover meal that Yeshua had with his disciples. A meal in which we are commanded to remember Yeshua, as often as you do this. We call it communion because we are communing with Messiah and therefore communing with God. We too are spared death. That is to say, even though we are worthy of death, God stayed his hand against us because he did not spare his hand with Yeshua. Having taken on our punishment in his flesh, we remember that broken flesh in the matzah that we eat. And he shed his shed blood in the wine that we drink. Thus we eat and drink in his presence. So what have we seen today? The children of Israel gathered around an altar to hear the Mishpatim and to be sprinkled in the blood of the covenant. That's what we've heard today. Next, we saw that 53 commandments of Mishpatim were really matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. That's what we've learned today. And we should be, as the Israelites were, we should in our hearts say, all that you say we will keep and do, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Finally, we saw the elders of Israel had a communion meal in the presence of God, where God stayed his hand, and they ate and drank. So what of all of this? It's very cool indeed, right? Yes, of course. It helps to elucidate the text. But what does it say to us? Well, we might ask why God stayed his hand even though the people saw God. To me, it seems that one answer might be that they ate it in a worthy manner. And by that, I mean that these same people all stood at the base of the mountain, heard God's instructions in righteousness, the commands of justice, mercy, and faithfulness, and they declared with one voice, all that you say we will do and we will keep. They declared their heartfelt intention to live as God wants them to live. They even had some of the blood of the offering splashed on them. Perhaps God saw that blood of the covenant and stayed his hand. It's just like what happened in Egypt, wasn't it? When he saw the blood of the lamb on the house. Can we ask ourselves the same thing? Can we approach our communion meal not as a rote, repetitive ceremony, but as one of actually eating and drinking in the presence of God? Should we seek to first commit ourselves to seeking justice, mercy, and faithfulness in every aspect of our lives, just as our Messiah commanded us? One more thing to contemplate. This portion ends, and the next portion, called Terumah, begins. That's the epic tale of the construction of the wilderness tabernacle. It's going to take many chapters. Couldn't it be then that this communion meal was necessary so that God could see their hearts were in the right place for the next important step, which is to build the tabernacle of God so that God may dwell among them? This was necessary before the tabernacle could be built. Then it might be important for us to remember what Peter tells us, right? That we are all living stones being built as a spiritual house to make spiritual sacrifices to the Lord. Therefore, our hearts must be in the right place for that building project to begin. Amen.